Marina Ottaway joins us from Washington. She's a Middle East Fellow at the Wilson Center. Marina, thank you so much for your time. How is what's happening across the Arab world and Arab-speaking North Africa different from what happened at the start of 2010 and that Arab Spring?
Well, I mean, there are great similarities in the sense of the crowds in the streets, of the, palpable anger of the population at their leaders. What seems to be different, at least in the countries where the second wave of uprising started, namely Algeria and Sudan, is that the protesters seem to be ready to, first of all, continue the protest indefinitely, and also they seem to be much more aware of what they need to do in order to not just, trigger and overthrow the regime, usually by the military, but to actually control power afterwards. And that's a very big difference from what happened in 2011.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Algeria, because a few months after Abdelaziz Bouteflika was thrown out after those mass protests, the army turning against him, people are still right now on the streets wanting a complete overhaul of the system. What's wrong with the governance in these countries that is causing so much anger amongst the people?
Well, first of all, there are regimes that had long overstayed their welcome. In Algeria in particular, the people in power are still the generation of the war for independence. The war for independence in Algeria ended in 1962. These are now old men who live in the past and who really have nothing to say to the new Algerians, most of whom were born after independence. So there is a tremendous generation gap. There is a lack of understanding by the leadership of the problems the population faces now.
Do you think that any of the protests are actually going to lead to real change that benefits the majority of the people? If we were to take one country as an example, Egypt, Hosni Mubarak is overthrown, Mohamed Morsi becomes the country's first democratically elected leader, and then he's overthrown by a man, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who people in Egypt say is even worse than Hosni Mubarak. So the Arab Spring there, the one that we were talking about that was symbolized by Tahrir Square, it doesn't seem to have worked. But could there be real change in other countries?
Well, there could be some change. The country that looks most promising right now is Sudan, because in the Sudan, after the overthrow of Bashir, by the military actually negotiated with a coalition of civilian forces, and they came to a power-sharing agreement. I won't explain it right now because it's actually quite complicated. But there is now a transition process that has been set in place for a period of 3 years before elections are going to be held. And this long transition period, it's good, because if elections were held tomorrow, the civilian political parties would not be ready for elections.
Is there any credence to the argument that people should wait for elections, that they should go back home and not cause so much chaos in the streets, wait for the elections and try to bring about change through the ballot box? Or are the political systems so how do I say it, so rigged in favor of the political elite that the ballot box won't actually bring about real change?
The ballot box will not, under the present condition, the ballot box will not bring about real change. In Algeria, the military wanted to have presidential elections within weeks of the overthrow of Bouteflika. The protester manages to resist. The elections are going to be now on December 12th. But the only people who are going to run are people from the same old, elite group that has controlled the party in the past. So that there is really not going to be any change. Election can make a difference if they are held under the control of an independent election commission rather than being held under the control of the military, and if there is time for political parties to organize. Except for the Sudan, those conditions certainly don't exist in any of the countries where protesters are in the streets now.
Marina, thank you so much. Marina Ottaway speaking to us from Washington.